as you know, is about immigration, an issue that moved to center stage in this country 3 years ago with the first presidential campaign for which xenophobia was the central theme, at least in living memory. I mean, we could argue about whether that ever happened before in American history. And of course, it's not just a US problem, but that's what we're facing. So I just wanted to share with you one of my favorite recent quotations that kind of expresses how I see this issue, which is from the late British Marxist theorist Stuart Hall. Some of you may know of him. He wrote a few years back, Du Bois once said, "The color line will be the central problem of the 20th century." And then Hall says, "I think migration will be the central issue of the 21st century." And to me, that's a very prescient comment. So anyway, here we are. Tonight we have three very distinguished and special speakers to share their insights with you about what we've been experiencing in the last few years with this president, and also looking forward, hopefully to 2020 or whenever we're in the post-Trump era, about what we might look forward to, what might be possible. So this is the plan. I'm going to introduce our speakers right now, all three of them, very briefly. And then you'll hear from each of them for about 15 minutes. Then we will have a little bit of back and forth among the three before we open it up to you, the audience, for questions and comments. Okay, and we hope to wrap up by about, what did we say, 8:15, 8:30. Okay, maybe we can go a little longer since we started so late. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which you will hear them, and you're in for a treat, like I said. So our first speaker is Maribel Hernandez-Rivera, who for the almost the past year has been the district director for AOC here in New York. She has a very distinguished resume prior to that. I'll go backwards. She's a graduate of NYU Law School, where I learned tonight she worked with another of our speakers, Moose. She, prior to that, was educated at Princeton and Harvard. She worked, before working for Ocasio-Cortez, she was the executive director of the legal initiatives portion of the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Prior to that, she was a supervising attorney at the Immigrant Justice Corps. She also worked for MALDEF as a civil rights attorney. She's going to tell you more about this herself, her personal story, but she was born in Mexico and arrived in this country at age 13, undocumented. Following that, you'll hear from our own, well, now, Deepak Bhargava, who is now on our faculty and is in fact co-teaching the course I mentioned that's advertised in here, which maybe he'll say something about later. He's now here at SLU as a distinguished lecturer in urban studies, but perhaps is better known to this audience as the former president and executive director of the Center for Community Change, where he worked for many years. He's also an immigrant born in India, also a Harvard alumni. Prior to working at CCC, which he did for a lot of years, he worked at Acorn, which no longer exists, but many of the more mature members of the audience may recall, as its legislative director. And he worked on a lot of different issues at the Center for Community Change, including poverty, welfare, and those issues, but especially in recent years, immigration reform. And he helped launch the Fair Immigration Reform Movement back in the year 2000. That's a while ago now. And if you look on the web at that organization, you will see the sort of who's who of the immigrant rights movement listed there as the affiliates of that coalition group. And then our third speaker is an old friend of the school, Muzaffar Chishti, who is another, and has been involved in immigration, I think, the longest of anyone, probably in this room, and certainly on the stage. He's a third immigrant, except for me, everybody here was born somewhere else, which is kind of appropriate for the topic. Muzaffar directs the Migration Policy Institute's office here in New York at the NYU Law School, holds degrees from Columbia and Cornell. I remember meeting him long ago when we were both much younger, when he worked for the ILGWU. Does anyone in this room remember those initials? The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, right? Quite. And then, of course, that union has successively merged into other unions, so eventually became Unite, and more recently, Unite Here. When Moose was at the ILG, he chaired its immigration project, which I believe was the first ever union's project to offer, this is right after the passage of the 1986 immigration reform law, to offer legal services to undocumented immigrants and others who needed legal assistance. He's become a very prominent expert on this, in this area of immigration policy, has testified before many committees of the Congress and so on. And so that's the lineup, and like I said, it's a pretty amazing one. Before I yield the floor to them, I want to make one other announcement, which I don't think is in the program, but because we're still planning it, but I just want it to be on everybody's radar. Deepak and I and Penny Lewis, who I think is here in the back, are working on a larger conference on immigration policy, which will be held at the CUNY Graduate Center down the street on 5th Avenue and 34th Street on May Day. It's an all-day, all-evening event, and we will have a very exciting program for you there, so stay tuned for news about that. If you're on the mailing list of SLU, you will hear about that in great detail, so please save the day. We're having breaks for all the different demonstrations that are occurring that day, so you can do that too if you want to, but we hope you'll come to our conference as well. And I think that's basically it. So let's start with Maribel. Mm-hmm.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I think I have two mics. I don't know if that works. We'll go like this. Thank you for having me. For me, it really is an honor and a privilege to be on this panel with Moose, with Deepak. As mentioned, I was a first-year law student when I first met Moose. And so to now be able to be here sharing this panel with him is really an honor. So thank you for having me. I want to begin by telling you the stories of the people that we see in our congressional district, New York 14. Is because this administration and many of the anti-immigrant movement, what they do is instead of talking about people, they talk about labels. And they label immigrants all sorts of things. And so what I want to make sure that we remember is that we're talking about people. We need to center our conversation around who it is that is being affected. So let me tell you, as being the district director for the Congresswoman, what we do in the district office is we see people every single day that come to our offices seeking our help. What's really empowering to be in that office is that because people know who she is, because people believe in what she's doing, they come and they ask for help. Most of our district is predominantly immigrant, very diverse, and so a lot of the casework that we see is immigration related. So one of the pieces, or one of the parts of the casework that we see is we have seen a lot of families being separated due to the Muslim ban, due to this travel ban where if you are from certain countries, you're not allowed to be here, right? So immediately as we see how these practices, these very racist practices are being put in place, we're seeing how they are separating people. I can tell you the story of a mother and her husband is in Yemen. They are married, they have 2 children. The husband has been in Yemen for a few years now, waiting for a visa to come reunite with their family. And so what our job is to contact immigration services and ask, why is this happening? The answer that we get for Muslim ban cases is administrative processing, which I know it means nothing to you, it means nothing to us. Because what administrative processing means is just they're looking into it and they're gonna get to it when they're gonna get to it. And so you have a lot of people, but imagine being that woman whose 2 children are depending on her, who want to see their father, whose father is in Yemen, who has been waiting to reunite with her family. And all she knows is, we can't be together because of administrative processing. We see that again and again. Another type of casework that we see, and we have seen it, I remember this family coming to our office. It was a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old. They come to our office, they come because their father has been detained. Their father has been in the country for more than 20 years. Their father has been regularly going to check in with ICE. But this time, what ICE, and every time that he's gone before, he checks in and he comes out. And all other previous administrations decided not to deport this person back to their home country because his only violation is an immigration violation. But he has a family here. He has a job here. He has demonstrated what great character he has. And yet, this administration, during his last check-in, decided that they were going to deport him. They gave him zero notice. The family didn't even think this could happen because they had been going through this for so many years, for decades. So the dad went in, got detained. The family, after he didn't come home that night, they start worrying. The daughter, the 19-year-old daughter, is in upstate New York going to college. The 13-year-old daughter is here with mom, and they don't know what to do. So eventually they come to our office because what the daughters tell me they did is they had a family meeting, and they're like, what do? We have no idea. They felt disempowered. They are freaking out that their father's going to be deported. And all they could think of was, well, there's the congresswoman, right? She said she can help people. So they went all the way from the Bronx. Well, first the 19-year-old daughter came from upstate New York, came home. Then they went from the Bronx to Queens to talk to us. And they came to our office. And both daughters are shaking. Both daughters are telling us what happened. They can't believe that this has happened, and they don't know what to do. Now, lucky for all of us, the first thing that they needed was an immigration attorney. Now, one of the things that I did previous to this role at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, my job was to be able to provide access to immigration legal services. The city of New York has many of such programs that they fund so that immigrants here can have that access. So because I knew that, I was able to make that phone call, figure out who an attorney would be so that they could connect with the family, right? And so then that attorney, and that attorney is somebody who I knew who's done this type of cases, because also this type of cases are not simple cases. These are very complicated cases. So they got on it, and then they were able to make sure that the father was released. Now, when the father explained what happened to him, is that they picked him up and they said, we're going to put you on an airplane, you're going back to your country. The father courageously said, I am not going back. When they tried to put him on that plane, he said, I'm not going back, and he made a scene. And at that moment, immigration services decided, we're not going to push this because we don't want bad press, right? But imagine having that courage. Imagine, and he said, I'm not going back because my children are here, because my family needs me. Imagine having that desperation and just saying, it doesn't matter what's happening, I'm just going to make sure I'm on the floor, I'm not going anywhere. But not everybody is able to do that, right? Not every 13, 19-year-old is able to think about, let me go to my congresswoman and they can help me. And so that's another type of story that we see. Another type of story that we see is people who have been applying for an immigration benefit, whether it's citizenship, a green card, a work permit, and their waiting lines are so long that they've been waiting and waiting and waiting without knowing why it is that they're not getting the benefit, even though they qualify for the benefit. And so our job, again, is to contact immigration services and say, what's happening here? But that's really as much as we can do, right? But at least now they know that somebody's looking into that case. But that's another type of story. Another type of story of what we see, and this is a very personal matter to me, is I mentioned that our district is very diverse. In our district, we have immigrants with all types of statuses. One of the things that this administration decided to do was end something called temporary protected status, which covered many immigrants here who had been here because of a natural disaster in their country, or because there was war, or because of something that they couldn't help, and so they had to come here. And we decided that because of humanitarian reasons, we were going to allow them to stay here. And I can tell you, in terms of TPS, my husband is somebody who's protected by TPS. And my husband is here, right there in the audience. And he has been in the country for more than 20 years. When we met, I was in law school. When we met in law school, he immediately told me I had TPS. And it was weird to me because I'm like, okay, and so what? You know, like, my name is Maribel and you have TPS. And what he said from the beginning, he said, well, you know, it can end at any time. And what I told him was, no, it won't. It's been reissued every 18 months. it was reissued. And it was reissued, why? Because the conditions in his home country, Honduras, are still dangerous. You go back, and there have been many people who have been sent back, and they go back to die, right? So many administrations, Republican, Democratic, they have reissued this temporary protected status, not only for Honduras, for El Salvador, for Nicaragua, for Nepal, for Tibet, not Tibet, sorry, for Nepal. And so what happened under this administration? For Haiti, under this administration, they decided that they were going to end these programs. And why? There is evidence that the reason why they did it, it was because of racism. It was because the people who were being protected by these programs were people of color. And so we have in our district, New York 14, many people who are protected by TPS, protected by DACA, right? The young children who came here and then they heard of DACA. That was a great hope. And they said, okay, now I'm going to continue my studies. I'm going to go to work. But now, under this administration, all of that is in limbo. They don't know what's going to happen to them. That is not who we are as Americans. That is not who I thought we would ever be seeing, but that's what we're seeing. Another group of people that we've met with in our New York 14 is we have met with undocumented immigrants who served as responders during 9/11. These are people who put their lives on the line when this country needed them, right? And so they went and they selflessly worked there. What is happening to them right now? I can tell you the story of our constituent who cannot speak right now, who cannot walk. He lives on a third-floor apartment. To be able to go downstairs, he needs to be carried by a family member or a friend. What happens to him most of the time? He's at home. He has a wife and a 6-year-old child. We met with that family. What the child said to us was, can you help my dad? Because I would really like to go to the park. Because my dad is in his condition, my mom stays at home all the time. So when I come back from school, I stay at home. We cannot even go to the park. A 6-year-old child cannot even go to the park because of the condition that her father is in because of the immigration status. So I want us to remember those stories as we then think about what the policy has been and what has changed. Now, what I can tell you is that despite all of what I just told you, I can tell you that I see hope. Because despite of all of that, there are, as was mentioned, there are organizations, there are people who have been working on this for decades. And there are people who relentlessly have been working on this and will not stop, even if we are under attack, even if it's really hard emotionally. So grassroots organizations. In our district, we are very lucky to have a lot of very vibrant organizations. We recently, in July, held an immigration town hall where the Congresswoman talked to the constituents about immigration. Who did we have there? We had ADICAR. We had African Communities Together. We had Asian Americans for Equality. We had Make the Road. We had This is Rising Up and Moving. You can hear the diversity of our constituency, but you can also hear how many organizations are there willing to fight. And these organizations are organizations who are really putting people in centering people, right? So they make sure that they organize affected people. So that it's not just somebody who is privileged saying, well, let me tell you how that person feels. Is that person really sharing their story? Because that's really important. So that's happening at the grassroots level. At the city level, as was mentioned, I work at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And to be honest with you, when I came to the United States when I was 13 years old, I didn't even know what my future was going to be. I didn't speak English back then. I didn't have documentation. I went into ESL classes. My biggest dream was to be able to learn English, because if someday I got deported, I could always go back to Mexico, carry people's suitcases at the airport, and then I would get a good tip, right? That was really like, I'm like, well, if worst comes to worst, I will have something. Luckily for me, I have been able to have a lot of opportunities. But when I was an undocumented 13-year-old, I never thought of a city caring about undocumented immigrants. When I joined the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, I was surprised. Well, the reason why I joined, it was because that was the moment when President Obama had said, we're going to create a program for parents who are the parents of either citizens or permanent residents. There was a program called DAPA, and we're going to expand DACA. And so what the mayor's office said was, okay, we want to help. We want to, we want to help coordinate this. And they got around a table talking to the different grassroots organizations and said, what do we do? And everybody said, well, you, mayor's office, you should coordinate. And then, to his credit, the mayor of this city said, okay, we got the money. Just, let's hire somebody and let's get going. So my job, when I joined that office, it was to create an immigration legal services program, so that people could have access to attorneys. Because what happens often, even when you have such great programs, there is fraud. There's people who are waiting to prey on people who are really desperate to get a solution, right? So Moya, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, does amazing work. They have Action NYC is the program that I mentioned. You can just call 311, say Action NYC, and you get connected to an immigration attorney. They have ID NYC, where you can have an identification regardless of your immigration status. That's happening at city level. There's work also happening at the state level. Now, at the federal level, why is it that I moved from the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to work for the Congresswoman? What caught my attention was when she was talking about abolishing ICE. That is not something that regular politicians talked about. That is something that the movement had been working on. That is something that the movement had really been saying, look, this is an agency that is rogue. This is an agency that is unaccountable. This is an agency that needs more oversight. And now we have seen this is an agency that is permeated with racism. But that is not what politicians talked about, right? Because that wasn't politically correct. Well, she did. And so when she said that, I'm like, wait, what? There is this politician, and then she started to get notoriety and everything. I said, you know what? Here's a woman of color, a Latina, talking about abolishing ICE. That's where I want to be. And now, since being there, what has she done with that star power that she had? Because when she started, she didn't have it. And I don't think anybody expected for her to have the star power that she has garnered. But what's amazing to me, when I see her on a day-to-day basis, when I talk to her, she is as humble as can be, and she is true to her values. What do I mean by that? She went to the border, and she did not allow people to tell her no. She went to the border, and she showed the conditions at the border, right? She showed how people had to drink from toilets because they didn't have water, potable water. She showed how people didn't have good food. She showed how hygiene was so bad that people's hairs, they were losing their hair, and they had sores in their mouth. So she used her platform to be able to show that. What else has she done? We have seen her in oversight committees, right? She is questioning. She's really questioning the people who believe they have the power, but what they have is cruelty. Because what they are doing is really using cruelty for cruelty's sake. That is their policy. There's no other policy. The policy is, let's use cruelty so that people can feel that disincentivized to be here. But we're not going to let them do that. So she does that. What else does she do? She recently talked about a legislation called the Embrace Act. What does that do? It allows people, all immigrants, regardless of immigration status, to have access to public benefits, such as SNAP, cash assistance, Medicare, etc. And why is that important? Because one of the things that people don't talk about is that immigrants do pay into the system. And there is much research that's been done that there's a lot there. So I'm going to stop here because I am out of time. But I just have to say that I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for listening.
So now Deepak Bhargava.
Good evening, everybody. Really honored to be here tonight with Ruth and Maribel and Moose. And my class is here tonight, so I want to give them a shout out. They will hear how our conversation last week shaped what I'm going to say tonight. And they're welcome to give me a grade on my oral presentation, so feel free. So I want to do three things with you tonight. I want to offer a frame for how to understand the policy and rhetoric of the Trump administration on immigration as the leading edge of a sharp political strategy to reverse the 1965 revolution in social policy that changed the complexion and demographics of the country. So I know strategy and Donald Trump are not necessarily things that always get put in the same sentence, but I think that they should. Second, I want to talk about, in that context, how should Democrats campaign about immigration in 2020, and how should progressives pursue a different policy assuming and hoping and working for a different electoral reality in 2021. And then lastly, I just want to pose some big picture questions without answering them about the long-term future of immigration policy in the United States. So past, present, and future in 15 minutes. So first, making sense of where are we under Trump. The human impact of the brutal Trump immigration policy has weighed heavily on all of our hearts, and I feel like Maribel did an incredible job of conveying the human impact, the humanitarian catastrophe of children in cages, of parents and children being separated from one another, kind of the soullessness of this regime at its core. But today I want us to consider not just the humanitarian tragedy of this policy, but the political strategy that lies underneath it, because I think understanding that strategy is crucial to thinking about what we do, how we act, how we respond as social justice activists. So the list of harms, I'm not going to go through it at length: border militarization, increased border enforcement, increased interior enforcement, including workplace and home raids, elimination of the Obama-era policies to deprioritize people without convictions in enforcement, the revocation of temporary protected status for people from Central America, from Asia, from Africa, the Muslim travel ban, the assault on DACA and Dreamers, the public charge rule, and other changes that make it much more difficult for low-income immigrants to access any kind of help when they need it. The agenda for these policies has not been just to stop illegal immigration. It has been to dramatically restrict legal immigration to the United States. So reducing refugee and asylee admissions to near zero. And I think that fact, the attempt to end legal migration to the United States, is really the key to understand what is the underlying political strategy here. And lastly, I want to say it's not just a matter of policy. There's been a very active attempt to demonize, to dehumanize people. And Maribel talked about this. And targeting whole populations, making them out to be less than human, whether it's S-hole countries or calling whole populations of immigrants rapists, et cetera. This is a strategy that has historically been used, dehumanization, to incite violence. And we have, in fact, seen a dramatic increase in violence against immigrants, against people of color in this country. And this climate of violence is actually part of the strategy, right? So if you are trying to eliminate immigration to the country and you incite violence that results in an Indian immigrant in a Kansas City bar being shot to death by an angry nativist, that's front page television news in India, and every Indian mom says to their sons and daughters, do not go, it is not safe for you in America. It's part of the strategy. It's not an incidental side effect, the hate, the rhetoric, the brutality. It's not just bad tweets. It's part of a political strategy. So it's been recently exposed, you probably read, by the Southern Poverty Law Center that Stephen Miller, the senior advisor to the Trump administration on immigration policy, has forwarded white nationalist emails, has promoted white nationalist theories. At some level, this is not surprising, but it should shock and appall us that he is still there. He is still setting the policy of this administration. And if you think about what is underneath all of this, in 1965, we had a revolution in social policy on two fronts that really changed the complexion of the country, the political complexion of the country. The first was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which enfranchised African Americans and changed the electorate of the country locally, nationally, in profound ways, the effects of which are still visible every day in our politics. The second, less usually talked about change, is the 1965 immigration law, which ended racial quotas and enabled people, including my family, to come from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America in much larger numbers. The political results of those two things, the Voting Rights Act and the 1965 Immigration Act, are dramatic. So there is no President Obama without the 1965 revolution, right? He got 39%. I will always say this to people, 39% of the white vote. That was his high mark, right? There is no President Obama in 1970 or 1975 or 1960. It was a consequence of that revolution. So the entirety of this agenda, of the Trump immigration agenda, can be understood as an effort to restore a racial order that began to be undone by the 1965 laws, the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act. So it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. It's not just kind of personal animus or hatred. It's the strategic use of policy and the bully pulpit by the President of the United States and the entire apparatus of the federal government to undo that demographic revolution in the country, to change the country from being on track to be a majority of color by 2040 or 2045. And in that frame, immigration is the leading edge, but it's not the only thing that's being done. The effort to undermine voting rights for people of color, and especially for African Americans, is part of that strategy. The effort to mess with the census in all kinds of ways to make sure that people of color, youth, vulnerable populations are not counted and therefore are not represented is part of that same strategy. So some people think that demography is destiny. That is to say that the fact that the country is becoming browner over time means that white nationalism can't work as a kind of political strategy. I think that is disastrously wrong. It is actually possible to use the lever of government, the levers of power of the federal government to restrict who participates, who can join, be a member of society, who can immigrate, who has voting rights in a way that disproportionately preserves or restores, depending on your perspective, this racist social order. So if that's the backdrop, let's talk a little bit about the response. So how should Democrats be campaigning in 2020, and how should we think about governing as progressives in 2021 if we can? So if Trump has made immigration the central issue in tearing apart the country, the central issue of his campaign to become president, the central driving thing he's delivering to his nativist base, my view is what Democrats have to do is to stand up forthrightly and without apology for the vision of a multiracial, inclusive democracy. That there is no other, you can't hide from the racism, you can't pretend it's not happening, you have to confront it directly and make an appeal to the country to vote against that. So immigration is part of it, but it's not the only part of what's going on. And it's important to speak to all the ways that this administration is essentially trying to shrink our idea of who is a full American, who belongs, who is part of our society. And in a sense, Trump has inadvertently done some important work to create the conditions for a coalition of the people that this administration would exclude, right, to kind of help revitalize, rebuild, re-energize a rainbow coalition, a new American majority, as it's sometimes called, to oppose this. And that's kind of the irony of the policy. So in terms of governing, quickly, 4 key priorities for what happens after the election. First, on executive action, a huge amount of the damage by this administration has been done using the powers of executive action because those powers are so vast for an administration in the area of immigration. So the elimination of DACA, the elimination of temporary protected status, enforcement priorities, children being separated from parents, enormous amounts of good can be done without congressional action from day one and should be done by a new administration. Also, the bureaucracy of the federal government, of the immigration apparatus, has essentially been weaponized against immigrant communities and communities of color. So it's going to have to be a very deep, aggressive dive to undo that fast. Second, the budget. We should be, even if Democrats aren't able to pass major legislation, we should be campaigning aggressively for a drastic reduction in the amount of money this country spends in immigration enforcement. There is no reason for it. There is so much better use to put to that money to promote human well-being, we can do better. Third, immigration legislation. So the big question is going to be, after this election, if Trump loses, how does the Republican Party make sense of why they lost the presidency? And you may remember there was a brief moment after the 2012 election when Obama won a second time, when leading voices inside the Republican Party said, we can't be quite so racist and maintain a electoral majority. So we're going to try to maybe get on a different side on immigration. We're going to change our stance on a few things. That didn't last long, that window, but they're going to have some debate if that happens. And if there is some reconsideration, which I doubt, given how far they've gone to the other side, then I think there will be an opening for looking at a bigger immigration approach. The last thing I want to say is this country will need, in terms of an agenda for a new administration, this country needs some healing and some restitution. The damage has been so profound to human beings that we actually have to repair and attend to the suffering that's been created. And the violence of the rhetoric has been so intense that I think there almost has to be like a moral accounting. This has to be a time when there's some real reckoning with the level of damage that's been done to our society. Demons have been let loose again in our society. And the genie's not going to get put back in the bottle without some really deliberate effort to confront the level of public racism that's been enabled. So last, just to very quickly say on the long-term vision, so immigration is clearly the biggest fault line in Western democratic societies, and I think it will be for the foreseeable future. And so, in a way, the question of immigration isn't just one of immigration policy anymore. It's whether a broader social justice, social democratic kind of agenda can be sustained against these attacks where we try to marginalize and demonize whole groups of people. This is going to get to be an even bigger and bigger problem with migration that's forced by climate change and other factors that drive people to move. So we need to have a conversation in our movements about the long-term immigration policy that we envision as a society. So we've mostly been focused on the urgent need to fight back against all of the horrible things that have been done by this administration. But what is the immigration policy that we want to see? How many people do we admit every year? Under what conditions? For what reasons? These are really, really deep and profound questions that we should be engaging. So I think that getting the answers right to that set of questions about our future immigration vision is going to be the axis on which our larger political project for social justice, economic justice, and racial justice will turn in the 21st century. So nothing could be more important. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Our first speaker is Muzaffar.
So is this working or no? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much. As always, I'm always delighted to come back to the school, not only because it reminds me of my own history in the labor movement. I learned everything I know about immigration in the labor movement. And I also remember this school when it was just a glint in the eye of our director and dean here, Greg. And so to see this turn into this empire is a heartwarming thing just by itself. So thank you for that, Greg, and thank you for bringing us together. I just want to make 3 broad points, because I think a lot of the stuff that I could cover has been covered by Deepak and Maribel themselves, so that we leave more time for the audience. First is that despite everything that both the speakers have said about the cruelty and the uniqueness of this administration on immigration, I want to start on an optimistic note. I, first of all, think that I don't know about broad history of this country. I'm not a historian. I know a little bit about immigration history. I think the immigration history of our country, Trump will be seen as an aberration. And the reasons for that are both historical and present. The historical is the law that Deepak talked about, the 1965 Act, obviously historic act that changed the demography of our country. That was necessary because Congress in 1921, exactly 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, had passed the National Origin Quota System, which established the racial quotas for immigration to our country and essentially made American immigration almost exclusively European till 1965. The kind of things that members of Congress said on the floor of the House and the Senate those days against the Irish, against Catholics, against Jews, and against Italians and the Slavs would be unprintable today. I mean, theories of eugenics were sold as science to convince lawmakers that one group of Europeans were intellectually and physically inferior to another group of Europeans. We're not there today. We're in a very different place on immigration despite Trump. The second thing is more current. I mean, I just saw recently one of the more convincing assessments of Americans' attitude towards immigration, not done by MPI, my institute, by actually our competitor institute, the Pew, which said that we have never been, as a country, more pro-immigrant than we are today. That even if you look at the end of 1990s, there were actually only about 40% of Americans thought immigrants were good for the country. Majority thought they were not very good for the country. Today, it has gone exactly the reverse. More than 62, 63% of Americans think that immigrants are good for the country and some think very good, and only about 40% think they are bad. And the divergence is in the party affiliation of people, that more Democrats today think that immigrants are good for this country than Republicans, and that's sort of where you see, in any case, all the fault lines of our politics. But even in that poll, when you see the millennials, even among Republicans, are much more pro-immigrant than millennials were about 20 years ago, even Republicans. So the trend is obviously all in one direction. And the last point, which I hadn't thought about till I just heard Deepak, that I'm one of the few people who thinks that Trump was one of the best things to happen to this country. That the point he made that the kind of coalition today that we are forming would not be considered necessary and potent before Trump's election. That people have woken up and realized what's at stake here, which probably would not have happened if Trump were not elected. So I see all these things as points of optimism, and Trump will be an aberration. But the second point I want to make, that even aberrations leave deep dents. And this aberration will leave a lot of deep dents. First, as Ruth herself pointed out, in the history of our country, we have never seen a man get elected, not just recently, ever, whose political campaign was completely framed around immigration. And not only did he win on that campaign, he actually kept his promise and has implemented everything that he could to keep that promise. When people say that the Trump administration was full of disarray on issue of immigration, it's completely in array. And it's because it had a playbook that it came with, sort of engineered in the office of Senator Sessions when he was the senator from Alabama, and implemented by his chief of staff, Steve Miller, at the White House. And they had a plan about putting statutes, regulations, internal office memos, staffing priorities with that to make sure their plan would be implemented. And that has obviously worked out. Secondly, we always, as Deepak pointed out, we know that the president has broad powers on immigration. We simply just don't recognize that. That historically, all courts have recognized that there's a lot of executive authority in immigration. It's considered akin to foreign policy. But no administration has gotten it more tested than it has gotten in this administration, because they have never used their executive authority to the hilt that they have used, which also means that advocates are challenging every action that the president implements, going all the way to the Supreme Court, which means more new law in executive action is getting framed every day. Now, those of us from the travel ban days, we all thought that the courts are going to be the bulwark of opposition to this president. That's all true at the federal court level, even at the appeals court level. But by the time these cases have gone to the Supreme Court, the dust has settled, and the Supreme Court has essentially reaffirmed the huge amount of executive authority that the president has. The third thing on this is that your power increases if you have no shame. I mean, a lot of other presidents in the past have recognized their power. And they basically said, we can't do that. I mean, I can personally tell you that both the George W. administration and the Obama administration thought about the policy of zero tolerance and thought they knew that zero tolerance was going to lead to separation of kids from their families, said, we can't do that. So other administrations have said, even if we can do something, we are not going to do it for all kinds of reasons that they found challenging. This presidency has no shame, so therefore the power increases immensely. And the last thing I want to say about this thing, where Deepak touched on much of that, and so did Maribel. We can talk about a number of things this administration has done, from public charge to census and all that. But to me, the two most important things which will have enduring impact. One is obviously what's happening at the Interior Enforcement. That by changing the priorities, everyone, by Homan, his ICE director, making the critical statement that all unauthorized people should look over their shoulders now. Now, you can't get more retail than that in fear. That even in blue states like New York and California, people are scared that if they leave their home in the morning, they may not come back and see a child. Now, that is the level of fear that only you can appreciate if you're unauthorized or have a family member you're not. The rest of us really cannot comprehend the level of fear. And he has really entrenched that fear in the community. But to me, the most important thing is that how he has completely changed the modern asylum system. That asylum system is one of the most important elements of our message to the world. We were founded on the concept of refuge and asylum as a country. We have tried to be the beacon of hope for the rest of the world so that they could take people who are persecuted. And the modern asylum system, as we know it, has essentially almost ended under the Trump administration by series of changes we have made at the border, from metering to sending people back in Mexico, to now the most important is that the transit country rule, that you're not even eligible to apply for asylum if you came through a transit country and did not apply there, essentially makes everyone unqualified. So you could say, as the Mexican colleagues would like to say, the Mexicans have built the wall and they're paying for it. And that's sort of what the accomplishment of this administration on asylum has been. And the last thing, which I've said, I think here the last time I was here, is the most important thing about this president is the narrative. And it never became more clear than during the impeachment process. I hope you noticed that. He wasn't asking the Ukrainians to do an investigation of Biden's. He was just saying, please do the announcement. The announcement to him is much more important than the action. And that actually has been true for a number of immigration things. That when he talks about sanctuary cities, I'll shame them. He makes the announcement. He actually did not shame anyone. This whole July 4th, when many of us were trying to celebrate the independence, he was issuing statements, there are going to be big raids all over the country. No raid happened. He was talking about Muslim ban, and not a major single Muslim country in the world was affected by the ban. But in terms of the narrative of the people, that made a huge difference, which is sort of what made people think that America is no longer a country that welcomes immigrants. And that, as I think Deepak pointed out in the Indian case, is going to harm us for a very long time. Thus, there are a lot of grievances here. So therefore, the last point I want to make is that what is the Democratic Party's response to these grievances? You could say that there's so many grievances that so far they have tried to really avoid the question. I think the fallback of the Democrats really is to avoid the question, because it's a very challenging issue for the Democratic Party and especially people running for office. Because if you want to take on the issues that are very important to the base and energize them, that may also antagonize a good part of the moderates in the base. And if you know not just about immigration, the big fight within the Democratic Party is it more important for us to appease the base or to try to convince the moderates. It's not an exception in case of Democrats. So almost all of them agree. What we're going to do on day one, we're going to decruelitize, if that's the word, make less cruel everything that the Trump did. You can have the whole list. The problem is they don't have a plan for day two. And we know exactly what the Democrats are against. It's to undo everything Trump has done, but we don't have a plan for what do you do in terms of an affirmative strategy. And the problem with not having a plan for day two is that the problems that we are confronting on immigration predate Trump. The number of things that we have to really confront have only been made worse by Trump, but they have been endemic to us for quite some time. And highlight only two of those. The asylum issue. There is an asylum crisis. To say that this is a made-up crisis by the president at the border would be to really deny the truth. There are a large number of Central Americans who would like to come to the United States. A recent study showed that about 75% of Salvadorans would like to come to the United States if they have an opportunity. So there's going to be a pressure for asylum no matter who the president of the United States is. If we don't reform our asylum system, which essentially quickly we can get more into it in the debate, which guarantees quick asylum to people who deserve it, but also leads to removal of people who don't deserve it, we're not going to have a credible asylum system that the rest of the country can live by. Second is the legal immigration system. Again, people who are feel pessimistic about our immigration. We still admit 1 million people a year as permanent residents. That has not changed even under Trump. That number actually hasn't gone down. So the legal immigration of 1 million people will probably stay there. The issue is how do we distribute 1 million people? Is it more on the basis of family, which is what now historically is, which leaves only 5,000 visas available for people in low-skilled occupations, which then gives rise to unauthorized people because there are no legal avenues for people to come. Those are really hard facts that all of us have to confront, and the Democratic Party, especially the presidential candidates themselves, will have to confront as we go to day two. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you all for very thoughtful comments on the situation. I'm going to just pose a couple of questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. So one thing that's really striking in your comments that I would like to hear more about from anyone who wants to speak about it is the kind of shift in the discussion of policy from the 11 million estimated 11 million unauthorized immigrants, which I think at the beginning of the Trump administration is what everybody was thinking about, and how are we going to win comprehensive immigration reform that gives status to those 11 million people? Still a huge unresolved question that is before us. And now, as Muzaffar just said, the kind of focus has shifted much more to the asylees, to people seeking asylum, and which is a different set of legal questions. So I wonder if you all could talk about what the implications of that are for thinking about the future and what kind of positive progressive policy we might have, because they're quite different, although not mutually exclusive, obviously. Do you want to start?
Well, since I'm still sitting down, I just think that's a really good question. I mean, I think people will say that I think the modern immigration moment started in 2000. I mean, there's a lot of immigration history, but the current mod started in 2000 when President Bush got elected in the US, President Fox got elected in Mexico, and we thought these two presidents, both pro-immigrant, were going to come with this grand alliance. And since then, the approach has been we should do a comprehensive immigration reform. And comprehensive immigration reform became the mantra of the immigrant advocates for the last, whatever it is,
20
till
years,
Trump,
almost
till
20,
Trump,
yeah.
till Trump.
16
and
years,
a cornerstone of that was legalization. That you had to do something for, at that point, close to 12 million people in 2008 at the peak, and that has gone down. That became the centerpiece, what should be done. So almost everything else was relegated to the margins. And I think it did cost us. The fact that we did not think about an asylum crisis, was because we're too busy completely focusing on the 12 million people and what they did, which tells you that, wherever the political sort of gravitas is at that time, we had done it. And that's the lesson, is that, look, these are things that can really creep up on you. Mm-hmm. And so we had to think about it. So in the Trump administration, since nothing was happening on legal and comprehensive immigration reform was never possible, in the meantime, the other crisis started, which we were not prepared for. I mean, to be also, because why this crisis started, just one more step, is that the Trump was focused on the war. The Trumps, that's how he got elected. It's all about the war. And he thought that, he talked about 12 million people come because they're jumping over the wall. They're single male Mexicans sneaking through. What he hadn't thought about is that phenomenon is gone. That's 10-year-old phenomenon. That the problem now is families coming from Central America in large numbers coming for asylum. That's how he got focused on asylum. It's because he had to move away from war. So therefore, the urgency is now all about asylum. But the urgency has also made us think that unless we really have affirmative reform of asylum system, we will be back at this even if we get a Democratic administration. We all know that no Democratic administration is going to afford to have large number of caravans coming to our border looking for asylum. So whoever the Democratic president is going to be, better be prepared for what that policy looks like when they are actually have to implement it.
So I guess the way I think about it, this conversation about asylum or asylees or not asylees versus undocumented. The way I think about it is those are labels. Why? Because this administration, in fact, under Sessions, they changed what it meant to be an asylee. They said they changed what qualified as somebody who could ask for asylum. So under this administration, previous to this administration, if you were fleeing domestic violence in your country because your country couldn't control that, because there was no rule of law where you can really go ahead and say, look, this is what's happening to me, so my country cannot protect me. Because your country couldn't protect you, you could ask for asylum, and people were granted asylum because of that. I actually represented somebody who was granted asylum under that legal theory, because that actually was there for decades. And that was something that the immigration rights movement actually fought for, right? It didn't just happen, but it was there. That's one. Two, many people from Central America are leaving because of gang violence. That was another reason why you could apply for asylum, because again, in Central America, we have evidence that the countries cannot control gang violence. And in fact, not only can they not control it, they might even just allow it. Mm-hmm. They might be in it, right? They might be like, okay, let me get whatever I need to get out of this. And so people were able to apply for asylum if they were able to show that in their home countries, that's what was happening. Under this administration, they changed that. Why? Because they wanted to, and that's what they've been trying to do, they wanted to change that label. Well, they're not asylees. They are X, Y, and Z. And I'm not going to repeat the labels that they have added to our immigrant communities, because those labels are hurtful, because I don't want to make sure that we're perpetuating that. But I think that's really important to note, that even the language that has been used has been turned against us, but not because things have changed. It's not that Central America right now is much safer than it was before this administration began. In fact, arguably, we can say that it's much worse, right? That hasn't changed. So the fact that somebody could apply for asylum 3 years ago under a certain basis, and they can no longer, because this administration changed the definition, is something really important for us to note. So when I think about asylum versus undocumented, I also think about when people talk about the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, we need to be very, very careful with labels. What we need to think about is, again, and that's where I'll go back to, it's not about what label you have, it's about you are a human being. You are coming here, and that child that got separated from their parents at the border, whether they were an asylee or not, they were a child. They should not have been separated from their mother if in their best interest it was for them to stay with their mother. So I want to be very careful as to how we say, well, one or the other.
I agree with that. I think the point about the Trump administration leading with a story and then the policy kind of being in service to the story is really important and offers us a lesson. So it's been an effort to activate fear and to work with some of the worst impulses human beings have and the deepest wounds of this country's history, and to inflame it. And I don't think the country is honestly in a great place on immigration today, or about racial justice, or about a whole variety of things. I think things have been let loose that have taken a toll. So for me, part of the question is, how do we think about the big policy priorities for a new administration that tell a story about the benefits of living in an inclusive, multiracial society that is welcoming to immigrants? And for me, that means building confidence is kind of a key part of what we have to do. So I think the story that, like, the amount of rebuilding that we have to do in terms of public narrative and support is immense. I think the 100 Days agenda on the administrative reform is clear and dramatic and will show immediate benefit to people. And then I think we have some hard thinking to do about how to rebuild a broad-scale public support for the kind of immigration policy we need.
All right, I'm going to just pose one more question before we open it up. And this is maybe on the more optimistic side. Given Trump, and even before Trump, under Obama, as you remember, a lot of things were not possible because of the Congress being controlled after the first 2 years of Obama's administration by the right wing. So things like DAPA, what Maribel mentioned earlier, which would have extended DACA to include parents of dreamers, more or less, a little more complicated than that. But anyway, other things that Obama might have been able to do were blocked too. So the focus, again, shifted away from Washington, which the federal government is in charge of immigration policy in principle, and the battleground became states and local jurisdictions. And ironic, so we know the things that came out of that, including some very anti-immigrant measures in some parts of the country. You might remember the Arizona Show Your Papers bill, for example. But then also in some more progressive places, including New York, things like sanctuary cities, the right to representation, et cetera. So I was hoping you three could all speak a little bit about what's been happening in the blue states and in the blue cities under Trump. Because, I'll just preface it by saying I know here in New York, actually, surprisingly, things have actually gotten better in some respects, right? It's partly because of changes in Albany, right? The DREAM Act, the driver's license, etc. Ironically, all that happened under Trump. So talk a little bit about that frontier and what's going on, if you don't mind. Do you want to start?
You want to start,
doesn't matter.
since you
Okay, I can start.
worked in local government?
Well, many thoughts, and I think this goes back to both what Moose and Deepak mentioned earlier, is having that playbook ready, right? And so even when you are in these hard times, you can't just be defeated. Mm-hmm. You have to start thinking, what is it that we're going to do when it's our turn, when we're ready? So what happened in New York State, again, it didn't just happen. People had been working for driver's license. People had been working for the DREAM Act for a long, long time. And then when there was that window of opportunity, they were ready. And they were able to, within the few days in office, they're like, okay, let's push for this. Now, so specifically in New York City, which is, again, that's where I first awoke to this idea of like, whoa, municipalities have a lot of power. Municipalities can make their people feel, even if you have the federal government instilling a lot of fear, and that is undeniable, and that is hard. I can tell you, I myself fear all the time about TPS and what can happen. At the same time, if you live in New York City, the fact that you can have an attorney, it is proven that if you have an immigration attorney in your immigration proceedings, the likelihood of you obtaining relief is exponentially better, right? But what happens in most places where you don't have access like this is if you have money, you can do it. If you don't have money, you get deported. And so that's actually, so we're talking about race, we've talked about ethnicity, but it's also an issue of class, right? That's another issue. Because if you don't have that access, but in New York City, what I tell you, and that's what I was super amazed by, is I came into the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. They said, okay, create this program. The program, at first, it had, I think it was $4 million. Right now, the city of New York, well, as of the day that I left, maybe in January, they were investing $30 million for immigration legal services. That is really speaking not only with your mouth, but with your actions. So what we've been able to see in New York City and elsewhere, we've been able to see people saying, we're going to use our power. And when you have an attorney, even if you're going against the Trump administration, you might be able to win. When I mentioned that person who was able to get an attorney, and they were about to be put in that airplane, and they weren't, and they currently are with their family. So there are ways that we can fight back. I'm not saying that it's all perfect, and we're still facing a lot of challenges, but cities can make a big change.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think there's one thing to think about is the way in which the criminal justice system and the immigration system are being merged systematically into an apparatus for the control of millions of people. And local government can do a huge amount to break that apart. Non-cooperation with immigration enforcement, right to counsel being a huge part of that. And then on the more kind of affirmative, positive vision side, I feel like helping people who can naturalize and fully integrate into American society. Like, there's so much more that we can do on that front. I think it's a huge hopeful edge of the immigrant movement and the success that's been won in New York and California and places around the country.
So this is actually a subject which we have done a lot of study on. I did 2 different studies on local law enforcement at 2 different periods. And it tells you that even in when you think federal government doesn't matter, that policy at the highest level does matter.
Yeah.
We did a study of local enforcement in the beginning of the Obama administration, in Obama 1, and we did a study in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And it was kind of striking that even the deporter-in-chief moniker that Obama got stuck with happened in the first Obama administration, because the deportations reached the peak. I'm not going to defend Obama for everything that he did, but I can tell you with conviction that I thought that no matter who the president of the United States was in 2012, they would be removing same number, in 2011, they'd be removing same number of people as Obama did. Because as Deepak said, our immigration removal system now is completely intertwined with the criminal justice system. That the funnel for removal comes from local cops. Mm-hmm. So it's just local, that we had secure communities which became universal in 2013. So everyone who gets fingerprinted at any post, you get automatically, if you're unauthorized, you get removed. So he became deporter-in-chief. By the second Obama administration, by 2014, they had managed to calibrate their priorities so well. We were stunned. I mean, I'm not always a fan of everything federal government does. But I was particularly surprised that for 2014, we at MPI concluded that 87% of the unauthorized people in the country had no fear of being removed. That they had done it so well in chain of command that if you're not a serious criminal or a very recent arrival, you would not be removed from the country. That takes a lot of doing in an administration to make that happen. And one of the reasons they had is that because they had gotten the local governments were no longer cooperating with the federal government. So you could say it's a good thing in one say that all the local governments can change the policies here and can improve the lives of people in those states and cities. Obviously, if you live in California and New York and Chicago and New York City, you're better off than living in Arizona and Georgia and all that. But I have to tell you, just as a citizen, it's not a good thing to happen for the country. You talk about country being polarized. Mm-hmm. It's not a good thing for the country that someone who makes a wrong left turn in San Francisco, nothing is going to happen to you. But if you make the wrong left turn in downtown Atlanta, you're going to get deported. That's not good for national cohesion. That's where this debate has fallen. Mm-hmm. We have become more torn apart on this than we were a few years ago. And again, it's because local governments had no choice in the absence of immigrants winning battles in the federal Congress, which hasn't happened since 2000. The only place they could win support was in local government.
Right.
In fact, I can say that without contradiction today, if you are an NT, if you are not a full supporter of immigrants in this city, you have no chance of getting elected. It's reached that of a litmus test. The litmus test in the city is how pro-immigrant are you?
Right.
Now, that is a change in the last 10 years, and obviously the absence of federal policy has made it happen. But that doesn't really mean that's the right solution for the plight that our immigrants are in.